The night they changed the locks, Everett didn't make a sound. He stood on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands. The porch where his daughter had learned to walk, where his wife had planted roses every spring for 31 years. And he looked at the key that no longer fit, and he didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. His son-in-law had made that clear enough at the kitchen table 3 hours earlier, while his daughter sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing at all. He was 64 years old. He had served 2 tours in the Kandahar province, come home with a knee that never healed right, and a silence in him that his wife Eleanor had spent years learning to sit beside without trying to fill. Eleanor had been dead for 2 years. And now this. He had 1 bag, 1 duffel, olive green, the same one he'd carried back from his second deployment. Inside, 2 flannel shirts, a pair of work pants, a Swiss Army knife, a photograph of Eleanor, and a dog. Well, the dog wasn't in the bag. The dog was sitting beside him on the porch, looking up at him with those steady amber eyes. A husky, gray and white, 7 years old. His name was Scout, and he had been Everett's since the day Eleanor had come home from the Humane Society with him wrapped in a blanket, saying he needed a job and so do you. That had been 5 years ago, when the walls of the house were too quiet, and Everett had started eating his meals standing at the counter. Eleanor had always known things before he did. He picked up the duffel. Scout stood and pressed himself against Everett's leg. "All right," Everett said quietly. "Let's go." He didn't know where he was going. He knew the direction. North, away from the town, away from the lights that felt hostile now, away from the neighbors who would see and wonder and talk. He had a truck, an old F-250 with 280,000 kilometers on it, and a quarter tank of gas, and the hills of northern British Columbia were an hour's drive if he pushed it. He pushed it. The town of Hadley Creek sat at the edge of the Omaneka Mountains, the kind of town that was slowly forgetting it existed. Half the storefronts on Main Street had paper in the windows. The sawmill that had given the town its reason for being had shut down 4 years ago. Most of the people Everett had grown up knowing had gone south to Kamloops or Prince George. He had stayed because Eleanor had loved the winters, loved the particular quality of light on snow, loved the way the mountains looked in February, when everything was blue and silver and still. He drove past the last gas station and kept going. He had no plan except movement. He couldn't go to his brother's. Neil lived in Vernon, and they hadn't spoken properly since their mother's funeral 6 years ago. A silence born of money and old grievances that had calcified into permanence. He had no friends left who still had spare rooms. He had his truck and his dog and the road ahead of him, pale in the headlights, climbing. He stopped at a pullout around midnight, cut the engine, and sat in the dark. Scout whined softly from the passenger seat. "I know," Everett said. He let the dog out to do his business, then stood beside the truck with his arms crossed and his breath misting in the cold. May in the northern interior still had teeth. He could see the mountains against the sky, darker than dark, massive, indifferent. He had always found that comforting, the indifference of mountains. They ask nothing of you. He pulled his flannel tighter and tried to think practically. He had maybe $40 in his wallet. His pension came monthly, deposited to an account his son-in-law, Marcus, had somehow gotten himself added onto in the months after Eleanor's death, when Everett had been too buried in grief to pay attention to the paperwork set in front of him. He had discovered this 3 weeks ago, when he'd tried to withdraw money and found the account had been changed. He had confronted Marcus about it. Marcus had been calm, almost pleasant, explaining that he and Diane had been managing the finances for Everett's benefit and that everything was perfectly in order. When Everett had asked to see the statements, Marcus had suggested that maybe it was time to talk about alternative living arrangements. That conversation had ended with Everett in the driveway and Scout barking from inside the house until Diane, his daughter, his only child, had come to the door and said, "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be." He hadn't gone back inside. That was 3 days ago. He had spent 2 nights in the truck at a rest stop south of town, eating crackers and the last of a block of cheddar he'd had in the cooler. He'd fed Scout from a bag of kibble he'd had behind the seat. And then tonight he'd driven back to the house. Foolishly, he could see that now, hoping something had shifted in Diane, hoping she'd come to the door and say she'd been wrong. She was sorry. Come inside. Instead, he'd found the new lock and the porch light switched off. So now he was here, at a mountain pullout at midnight, 64 years old with $40 and a dog and 2 flannel shirts. He got back in the truck. Scout immediately put his chin on Everett's thigh. "You," Everett said, putting his hand on the dog's neck, "are the only one with any sense." He drove another 20 minutes up the forestry road before his eyes got heavy and he let himself sleep. In the morning, the world was fog and silence. He had slept at an angle across the front seat, Scout draped across his legs, and when he sat up his knee was screaming, and his neck felt like someone had worked it over with a board. He was 64. He was not built for this. He got out and stood in the fog. The forestry road was rutted and narrow here, climbing through second-growth spruce. The air smelled of pine resin and cold water. Somewhere nearby there was a creek. He could hear it. Scout jumped down and immediately put his nose to the ground, quartering back and forth with that focused intensity that meant he was onto something interesting. Everett ate the last 2 crackers from a sleeve in his bag. He considered his situation. He had no phone. He'd had a phone, but it had been on the family plan Marcus managed, and it had stopped working 2 nights ago. He had no map. He had the forestry road, which he knew went up into the Omineka watershed before looping back south eventually. Though he couldn't have said how far or where. He had maybe enough gas to get back to Hadley Creek if he turned around now. He did not turn around. Instead, he followed Scout, who had disappeared into the tree line and then reappeared 50 meters up the road, sitting, watching, waiting for Everett to catch up. This was a habit of Scout's on walks, ranging ahead and then pausing, making sure Everett was following. Eleanor had always said Scout thought he was the pack leader, and Everett was his very large, slow puppy. They walked for about an hour. Everett's knee held grudgingly. The fog burned off by mid-morning and the mountains came clear above the tree line, still carrying snow on the upper faces, sharp-edged against the blue. He was not thinking about Diane. He was trying not to. He thought instead about the house, which he had built in 1988 with 2 friends and a bank loan, framing it over 2 summers. He thought about the garden Eleanor had made on the south side, the one that grew tomatoes improbably well given the latitude. He thought about the kitchen table, where he had sat every morning for 30 years, drinking coffee, reading, listening to the house wake up. He had not thought of it as something that could be taken from him. It had seemed too solid for that, too much a part of the shape of his life. Scout had stopped again, but this time he wasn't looking back at Everett. He was looking at something off the road, upslope, his ears forward, his whole body still in the way that meant he had found something that required consideration. Everett stopped beside him. "What is it?" Scout didn't move. Everett looked where the dog was looking. Through the spruce he could make out a shape. Not a natural shape, the wrong geometry for forest, too regular, too intentional. He pushed through the undergrowth, following the dog when Scout suddenly moved, purposeful now, threading through the trees. It was a cabin, or what had been a cabin, a long time ago. It was small, 1 room maybe, built from rough-cut logs that had silvered and settled over decades. The roof was mostly intact, sawed and split shakes, mossy. 2 windows, no glass remaining, but the frames were solid. A door, slightly ajar, sagging on its hinges. The whole thing had been cut into the base of a granite bluff, in a way that used the rock as a back wall, which was probably why it had lasted. The rock kept it from shifting. Everett stood in the clearing before it and thought, someone lived here. Not recently, but someone had. The clearing had been made deliberately. You could see the old stumps, weathered to gray, where trees had been taken for the build. There was a stone-lined fire pit out front, partially collapsed. A rusted iron hook in a spruce tree that might have been for hanging game. Scout walked up to the door and pushed it open with his nose and went inside. Everett followed. Inside was dim and cold and smelled of must and old wood and, faintly, something that had lived here and left. Mice, probably. The floor was packed dirt. In the corner was an iron stove, small but solid, its pipe still going through the roof, capped with a flashed collar that had kept most of the weather out. There was a wooden platform against one wall that had served as a bunk. A shelf still attached, holding nothing but a rusted tin and a glass bottle. He stood in the middle of it and turned slowly. The roof was solid. The walls were solid, tighter than they looked from outside, chinked with moss that had dried in place like mortar. The stove would need cleaning, but the pipe was intact. The floor was cold but dry. It was shelter. He sat down on the edge of the wooden bunk and put his hands on his knees and looked at Scout, who was sniffing methodically at every corner. "All right," he said. "Maybe for a night or two." He spent the rest of the day in practical motion, which was where he was most comfortable, always had been. In the doing of things, not the feeling of them. He found firewood almost immediately. The previous occupant, whoever they had been, had stacked splits under a lean-to at the back of the cabin, protected by the rock overhang. The wood was old and dry as bone. Spruce and birch mixed, and there was more of it than he'd expected, enough for many weeks of moderate use. He cleaned the stove flue with a stick and a rag from his bag, found a cache of birch bark and dry tinder in a tin on the shelf, and had a fire going within the hour. The stove drew well. The cabin warmed faster than he expected, the rock wall behind it, holding and radiating heat. He found water in the creek he'd heard that morning, 50 meters down the slope, running clear and cold over granite. He didn't have a pot, but he had the metal camp cup he always kept in the truck. He'd retrieved it along with the cooler and the kibble, and he boiled water over the stove in the evening. He found food less easily. He had the kibble for Scout, and he had half a box of crackers left, and that was roughly it. He needed to think about that. But not tonight. Tonight the fire was going, and the cabin was warm. And Scout had arranged himself across Everett's feet as he sat on the bunk, and the silence outside was the good kind. Mountain silence. The kind that asked nothing. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the last year of her life, when she'd been sick in a slow and inexorable way, and he had sat beside her hospital bed holding her hand, and she'd said to him one afternoon, "Everett, when I'm gone, don't you dare let this be the end of you." She'd said it plainly, the way she said everything. "You're not finished. I need you to know that." He hadn't believed her at the time. He was less sure now. Over the next several days, he established a routine. He rose before light, stoked the fire, took Scout down to the creek, then spent the morning ranging the slopes around the cabin. He found serviceberry and wild onion, and some kind of spring green, he was fairly confident was miner's lettuce. He found where the grouse gathered in the late afternoon, near a muskeg to the east. He had no snare wire, but on the third day he found a length of rusted fencing wire near the old stumps and fashioned 2 rough snares, the way his grandfather had shown him once, a long time ago, in the bush outside of Terrace. By the 4th day he had a routine. By the 5th he had stopped feeling entirely frantic. By the 7th he had almost stopped listening for the sound of a vehicle on the forestry road. He was not hiding. He just wasn't ready to go back yet. He needed to think. He needed to decide what he was going to do about Diane, about Marcus, about the house and the account, and the particular quiet violence of what had been done to him. He needed to do this away from the noise of other people's judgments. Scout helped, in the way Scout always helped, simply by being present, by demanding nothing beyond the essentials of food and motion and occasional contact. In the evenings, Everett talked to the dog with a freedom he hadn't felt in years. He talked about Eleanor. He talked about Kandahar, things he had never told anyone. Not a therapist, not the VA counselors, not even his brother. Things that had lived in him like stones in a pocket, heavy and unremarked. Scout listened with great seriousness. "You're the only one I ever told," Everett said one night. Scout put his chin on Everett's knee and closed his eyes. It was on the 9th day that everything changed. Everett had been out since early morning following the creek upstream, looking for the spawning beds he'd seen sign of, thinking he might try to fashion a gaff. When Scout stopped dead on the trail, he was not doing his curious and interested stop. He was doing his other stop, the one with his hackles up and his tail low, and his whole body broadcasting something urgent and alarmed. Everett stopped behind him, listened. Wind, creek, the sound of his own breathing. Then, faint, intermittent, almost certainly imagined the first time. But there again, a voice. Not speaking. Something less than that. A sound that might have been someone calling. Or might have been someone beyond calling. Scout moved. He went off the trail. And up the slope at an angle, not running but moving with intention, pausing every 30 meters to look back and ensure Everett was following. The terrain steepened. Everett's knee complained steadily. He put his hand on the rock face above him for balance, climbed through a break in the granite, came out on a shelf of exposed stone above the tree line. Below him, in a shallow depression between two rock falls, he saw them. Two people. A man, unconscious or close to it, sitting with his back against a boulder, his head down. A woman kneeling beside him, her hand on his chest, looking up toward the ridge with a look that Everett recognized. Not panic, past panic, into the flat calm of a person who had been afraid for too long and had exhausted even that. She was wearing a day pack and trail clothes, neither warm enough for the temperature. The man's face was gray. Scout was already picking his way down toward them. Everett followed. "I can hear you," the woman called, her voice ragged. "Please, we need help. He's hypothermic, I think." He got to them in 3 minutes. He crouched down beside the man first, checking his pulse, steady but slow, too slow, and his color, and his breathing. The man's name, the woman's was her husband, Ian. They had been hiking a trail 2 ridges over when the fog had come down fast, and they'd gotten turned around coming off the summit. That had been yesterday afternoon. They had spent the night in a thermal blanket. She showed him the foil emergency blanket they'd shared, and this morning Ian had started to go downhill. Her name was Frances. She was maybe 45, composed in a way that told Everett she was holding herself together by main force. Her hands, when she showed him the emergency blanket, were shaking. "How far is the trailhead?" Everett asked. "I don't know. We were off route." "I don't." She stopped. "I don't know where we are." Everett looked at Ian. Moving him was going to be hard. Leaving him while they went for help was worse. The man needed warmth, needed it now, not in the 4 or 5 hours it would take to reach anywhere with a vehicle or a signal. He looked at the cabin, which was perhaps a kilometer away, and 200 meters below. He looked at Frances. "There's a cabin," he said. "Old, but it's dry, and there's a fire going. That's the priority, get him warm first. Can you help me with him?" Frances nodded. It took 45 minutes to get Ian down to the cabin. Everett and Frances made a kind of carry between them. Ian's arms over their shoulders, half dragging, half supporting his weight down the rocky slope. Everett's knee went from complaining to screaming, and then, somewhere past the tree line, to a bright steady roar that he managed by simply not acknowledging it. He had done this before. Not quite this, but close enough, in worse conditions, with worse outcomes anticipated, and he knew how to set pain aside when the doing of things required it. Scout ran ahead of them and disappeared inside the cabin. When they got Ian through the door, the cabin was warmer than it had been. Everett got the fire up high, stripped Ian's wet outer layer, wrapped him in both of Everett's flannel shirts and the foil blanket, got him lying on the bunk. He boiled water, made it into something approximating broth using the wild onion he'd gathered that morning. Got a cup of it into Ian slowly while Frances held his head. Within an hour, Ian's color was better. Within 2 hours, he was conscious, confused, embarrassed, apologetic. Within 3 hours, he was sitting up and demanding to know where his pack was. "I wasn't leaving you," Everett said simply, when Frances thanked him for the 3rd time. That was never a consideration. She looked at him for a moment. "You live up here?" "For now," he said. In the morning, when Ian was steady enough to travel, Everett walked them out. The forestry road was 3 kilometers down. His truck, still with its quarter tank of gas, was parked in the same pullout. He drove them to Hadley Creek, to the motel on the highway where they had a room. Frances had her phone, and by the time they reached town, she had connected with the search and rescue team that had been looking for them since the night before. A small, tired group of volunteers who met them in the motel parking lot and shook everyone's hands with the particular relief of people who had been braced for something much worse. Frances pressed something into Everett's hand before he left. He looked down. 3 folded $50 bills. He tried to give them back. She wouldn't take them. "You didn't have to come down that slope," she said. "You could have sent the dog." He didn't know what to say to that. He put the money in his shirt pocket and said goodbye. He sat in the truck in the parking lot after they'd gone inside. Scout sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder in that dog way that meant nothing and meant everything. He had $150 and a quarter tank of gas and a cabin in the mountains that wasn't his, and the particular ache of a knee that would need ice and rest and probably a doctor's visit before he asked much more of it, and something else. Something that was harder to name and that he hadn't felt in a while. He drove back up the forestry road. He stayed 3 more weeks. He did not decide to stay so much as he kept not leaving, which is a different thing. He fixed the door on its hinges using wire from the old fence and a rock as a mallet. He rechinked the worst gaps in the walls with mud and green moss, the way he'd read about somewhere long ago. He caught 2 grouse and a rabbit, and traded stories with the forest in silence, which was a thing you could do if you had enough time and no one to interrupt you. So he thought about Diane. Not with the rawness of the first days, which had been almost physical, a grief like a fresh wound. He thought about her more steadily now. The way you can look at something directly when the light is different. He thought about who she had been at 7 and who she had become at 38, and about the way people sometimes grew around the people beside them, shaped by them, and how Marcus was a particular kind of person. Not cruel exactly, not evil, but small in some fundamental way. Small in the way that needs to diminish others to feel large. He did not think Marcus had taken his house. He thought Marcus had taken his daughter, and that was a loss of a different kind. He thought about what Eleanor would say. She would say, "You can't carry her back to herself. You can only keep the door open." He would have to get a lawyer about the account. That was first. He had no appetite for the confrontation of it. He was 64 and tired, and the mountain cabin had given him something like peace, a peace he hadn't expected. But he was not going to let the thing stand unchallenged. That was not in him. 2 tours in Kandahar, 31 years of marriage, and a chest that had carried things without collapsing. He was not going to let Marcus take his money and his house and his daughter without at least standing in the door and being clear about what had happened and what he was owed. On the 22nd day, he drove back down. He did not go to the house. He went to a lawyer. Her name was Priya Mehta, and she operated out of a shared office above the pharmacy on Main Street, and she was 20 years younger than Everett and almost precisely as no-nonsense. He laid out the situation without self-pity, just the facts, and she listened with her pen moving and her face still. "The account situation," she said when he finished, "is potentially criminal. That's not an exaggeration. There's case law on this. I don't want to put my daughter in jail," Everett said. "I understand that, but you want your money back." "Yes." "And the house?" He sat with that for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it took 2 months." Priya was efficient and unimpressed by Marcus, who had clearly expected, and perhaps been told by Diane, that Everett would be too exhausted and too old and too beaten down to push back. Priya had a way of disabusing people of that expectation that Everett found quietly satisfying. The account was corrected. A sum was returned. The house title, which had been in a process of transfer, that Marcus had engineered through a series of requests to Everett during that foggy first year of grief. Requests Everett had signed without fully understanding what he was signing, was contested, and after a letter from Priya to Marcus's employer, who was a business owner in town, and had strong opinions about the word fraud. Marcus withdrew his claim entirely. He didn't give Everett back his daughter. But then Marcus didn't own her. It was November when Diane came to the house. Everett was in the kitchen when Scout barked, not alarmed, just announcing. He went to the window and saw her car in the driveway, and he stood there for a moment before going to the door. She looked the way she had always looked, which was like Eleanor around the eyes and like Everett everywhere else. His stubbornness, his silence, his particular way of standing with her arms slightly away from her sides, as if always ready for something. She was carrying nothing. She looked like she hadn't slept well in weeks. He opened the door. Scout pushed past him and went to her immediately, tail going, and she knelt down and put her arms around the dog and pressed her face into his neck, and Everett looked at the mountains over her shoulder and waited. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was muffled by the dog's fur. He didn't say anything right away. He had thought about what he would say, had rehearsed various versions of it on the mountain, and in the weeks after, some of them sharp, some of them measured, some of them long and complete in the way you can be in your head when there's no one to interrupt you. Now that she was here, none of them felt right. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's cold." She stood up. Her eyes were wet. He stepped back and she walked past him into the house he had built, the house she had grown up in, the house he had almost lost, and Scout went ahead of them, down the hall to the kitchen. With his tail still going, utterly unconcerned with the weight of what was happening, interested only in the fact that someone had arrived and might possibly be interested in him. "Put the kettle on." Everett put the kettle on. He did not know if Diane and Marcus were still together. He did not know what had shifted in her, what she had finally looked at directly, and been unable to look away from. He did not know how many of the conversations ahead of them were going to be hard, and how many were going to be something else. He knew that she was here, that she had come on her own, that she had said she was sorry, and that the word had sounded like the beginning of something rather than the end. He thought about Eleanor. Keep the door open. The kettle began to whistle. "Sit down," he said to his daughter. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall over Hadley Creek, soft and quiet and unhurried, covering the garden and the driveway and the mountains beyond, making everything new again, the way snow does when you've been waiting long enough to let it. Scout sat down at Diane's feet and put his chin on her knee, and she put her hand on his head, and for a long moment no one said anything at all.